Thanks again for joining us at the 2024 Sloan Sport Analytics Conference, Competitive Advantage Talks presented by CAGR, also known as the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Mathieu Perrin, and I'm a Master of Science in Management Studies student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce the presentation Beyond the Scoreboard, the Science of Crafting Member-Centric Entertainment Platform, presented by PrizePicks. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Robert Landerman, Director of Data Science at PrizePicks.
Cool. What's up, guys? How's everyone doing today? Really excited to be here. Like he said, my name is Bobby Landerman. I'm the Director of Data Science here at PrizePicks. And if you don't know us, we are a daily fantasy sports platform where you basically build a lineup, build a entry of players with various stat types, various markets, choosing more or less on player predictions themselves. So excited to be here, excited to talk to you about kind of the science of crafting member-centric entertainment platforms. So I know that's a lot of words. I know not necessarily super self-explanatory, so I'll dive into the ins and outs of what we mean and a specific feature that we've launched that actually I think encapsulates what we're going for here. All right, so the agenda here. We're taking a member-centric approach to data, so we're going to talk about what it means to be a member-centric platform in general. We're going to talk about why we put so much emphasis on this, and then how we can accomplish that. All right, so getting into the what it means to be a member-centric platform. This is kind of a very broad, very open-ended question, dependent on the industry, dependent on where you're at. It's really different needs. But in general, when we at PrizePicks think about a member-centric platform, we're looking at really those personalized experience, driving member engagement, driving interaction with the application, and really just creating that all-encompassing, highest possible satisfaction we can get. To do that, we do a number of different things, which we'll be getting into here. But this is Sloan. We're talking about the data behind things. We're really working on leveraging the data itself, making sure that the data is what's driving our decisions here. All right. Now, why we put so much emphasis on this? Just kind of a list of bullet points here. It's fairly self-explanatory. Really what we're thinking about is creating engaged and driven users who love interacting with the platform, who know that the platform cares about them, who knows that the platform is going to be looking out for them when they actually open the app and when they interact with it. So that creates more valuable members. You always are going to want people involved in, like I said, regardless of the industry itself, you want people who are engaged, you want people who are involved, entertained, and that drives that loyalty, that drives that retention, that keeps people around, and that's really what drives value here. We're not looking to acquire a bunch of users and have them leave because they don't enjoy the platform. We need to keep them around, we need to keep them engaged. All right, how we can accomplish this. So this is, like I said, kind of a very broad topic, and there's a number of different ways that you can look at a member-centric approach with data. There's tons of different product features, tons of different approaches that various companies, various industries will take here. For our specific example here, we're going to be talking about a specific effort we've made, a product feature we've launched in the last year or so, which is our reboot policy. So I'll get into what that is, how that kind of drives the engagement, how that drives the member centricity that we're talking about here. All right, so getting into reboots here. What are reboots? So first I'll give a brief background here. A lot of you probably are familiar with fantasy sports, probably familiar with having a fantasy team or having a team that you enjoy to watch, whether it's a NBA, NFL, whatever it ends up being. Kind of the worst experience that you can have, obviously, other than your team losing, is your team losing because of an injury. All of us have probably had a situation where, you're in a fantasy football championship or you're in a fantasy football playoff game and your star player goes down with an injury early in the game and you've now lost your fantasy football championship, or your lineup is over, or your team lost in the championship, things like that. We recognize that that is a very negative experience for our members. We recognize that across the board in the sporting world, there's a lot of variance. There's a lot of things like that that can create negative experiences. So when we're looking at that, we're trying to determine how we can solve that. So how this came to our attention, the first thing that PrizePicks kind of interacted with this was 3 or 4 years ago, maybe a bit longer, the Zion shoe tearing incident, the UNC Duke game where he was in the game for about 30 seconds and then his shoe exploded and he was out for the rest of the game. So a lot of negative member experience there. We knew that that was a problem, but we didn't really have a solution to deal with it at that point. Where we really kind of took the first steps here was OBJ 2 years ago in the Super Bowl tore his ACL very, very early in that game. And if you were on Twitter, if you were on socials, you're looking at that and you're seeing a lot of negative sentiment around that. You're seeing people with their entries on PrizePicks who are upset. You're seeing people with their fantasy leagues. They made it to the championship and now they're done for because of a unexpected occurrence that they can't necessarily account for. So that was our first kind of reboot. We kind of just did it to improve member experience without looking into the data itself. But that really opened our eyes to, hey, there's a lot of negative member sentiment. There's a lot of, pain points here with injuries, with players leaving games that can kind of create issues and create those pain points. And we wanted to figure out how to solve it. So that kind of leads into the problem statement here of, how do we solve the issue of players getting injured or players leaving the game early, players getting benched, anything that causes a player to play in one part of the game and not the other. How do we fix that issue? How do we protect our members in these cases? So, like I said, we started tackling this after the OBJ Super Bowl injury. And, our first step here was really, we needed to do some data analysis to determine how frequently is this occurring. We know it happened in a high-profile game like the Super Bowl with a high-profile player like OBJ, but the question is, how often does it occur in actuality, and where is it occurring most? So what we ended up doing actually was scraping Twitter injury feeds because you would hope that a lot of these data feeds are robust enough to have injury data, but what they end up having is a lot of times very just high level, how many snaps they had. You don't know if they left of an injury. You don't know when they left the game. It's kind of just a crapshoot there. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with scraping Twitter. There's some nuance there. It can be a bit of a pain, but that's what we ended up having to do for our initial analysis was really figure out, looking at the beat writers, looking at the sideline reporters saying, hey, this person's in the blue medical tent. They tweaked their elbow. They tweaked their leg, whatever. No one injured their elbow. I don't know why I said that. But really, so what we end up with here is, a data frame of, when a player gets injured and when they last played in the game. So here we've got Greg the Leg and Riley Patterson. Kickers generally aren't the target of our reboots here, but it does happen, and you can imagine the negative member sentiment, negative member experience with, you have a kicker in your entry that, gets injured. That's just not what you want to see. So then the next step is, we have the baseline data of when these players are getting injured, what position they are, what game they got injured in, all of that kind of stuff. Now we want to look at, let's develop the distributions of injury results by position from that scraped injury data. So obviously, we're looking at kickers, running backs, quarterbacks for the NFL. For NBA, we're looking at shooting guards, centers, all that kind of stuff. The injury rates there differ significantly based on position. Like I said, kickers are much less likely to be injured than a running back. In the NBA, a center might be more likely to be injured. So we also wanted to determine the probability of injury within each segment of the game. So how frequently are players getting injured in the first quarter, in the second quarter, in the first half? What we ended up finding from that analysis is, we're able to encompass the most members, impact the most members by choosing a cutoff of anyone that plays in the first half of the game that doesn't play in the second half. So that was kind of our what we came out of with this. So now that we have the kind of injury rates, expected injuries per game, we need to do this in a predictive fashion. We need to look at kind of a forward-facing approach here to determine if we want to do reboots into the future, what does that actually look like? So, our next step here is basically doing a simulation 10,000 plus times for every game, for every weekend, for every matchup, throughout the entire season for NBA, for NFL. And really we're looking at taking that initial injury rate data, we're random sampling that to determine, what's the actual probability of, this player getting injured in this game, this player getting injured in this game, and we end up with in totality, a distribution of injury rates and injury distribution for the entire season. So on the right there, I know the code is a little gross. Don't necessarily, want to go through all of that. Feel free to come up after, ask me about it at any point. But really what we end up with here is, a data frame of, for this game, for this week, whatever kind of granularity we want to look at it with, here's the sim, and here's the number of injuries, and here's how many impacted members there would be on our side. So that's what we're using to develop the actual distribution. We can determine what the 50th percentile number of injuries would be for the wildcard week in NFL 13, NFL week 13, or whatever, anything like that. The Super Bowl, how many injuries do we expect? All of that kind of stuff is basically developed by figuring out the distribution from those injury results. So now that we have that distribution, now that we know the percentiles, now that we know, possible outcomes, we're going to loop it back into, maximizing member impact. This whole talk is about member centricity, is about taking care of your members, providing that engagement, making sure that they're having a good experience. That's what we strive for at PrizePicks. That's really what we're intending to do with all of our product launches. So what we try to do now is, okay, we have that distribution. How do we take it, and how do we make it so that it impacts the most possible members? So we tested a number of different approaches here, and we ended up deciding that the best way to impact members and to make sure that they still are, staying engaged after an injury is to treat it as if that player was a tie. So if someone gets injured in the first half, they don't play in the second half, that gets treated as a tie for our members that are taking that player in their entry. So that allows them to continue to stay engaged with the application, continue to stay engaged with the game itself. If you have a lineup of 4 players from an NFL game and one of them gets injured, we don't want you to lose interest in that game because of that injury that occurred in the first quarter. We want you to continue to stay engaged, continue to stay entertained, continue to have that companion of PrizePicks and the sporting event itself. So, even if an injury occurs, your entry is still alive. You can still watch that game and still get that enjoyment out of it. So that's really what we decided on doing there. All right, so that kind of gives us the baseline of injuries. It gives us the baseline of reboots. That's how we got the actual policy itself. We decided on first half. We initially opened it up with NFL and then into NBA. Now the question becomes, what's next? It's never okay, we implemented a policy and now we're hands off. We're going to wipe our hands and say, hey, it's good to go. We feel really confident about it and do no further analysis. The analytics never stops here. So the first thing that is kind of a next step here is we have to do staffing. We have to do forecasting, day over day, week over week, to make sure that we're adequately staffing for when injuries are going to occur, when we think reboots are going to occur. We want to make sure that our social team, our customer support team, they're not getting overloaded by our members coming in and saying, hey, this injury just happened, we need to be taken care of. Like, we implemented this policy, now let's make sure that we're actually taking care of our members, let's make sure that we're providing them the support they need. So a lot of that is, forward-facing projections of how many injuries are going to occur during this weekend, during the next weekend, during these games, based on how many players are we offering for that, how many projections are we offering, how many stat types, all of that kind of layers into this forward-facing projection here. All right, this is a fun one. Another thing that you always have to take into account, I have it as rule changes. There's a bunch of things that kind of fall under this umbrella. But the landscape of sports is not static. There's constantly things changing. There's new rules being implemented. There's equipment changes. There's just kind of meta changes in a way of how teams handle things. So, we're using historical data to simulate how many injuries we anticipate going forward. How accurate is 2017, 2018, 2019 injury rates to, what's happening right now? That is a little bit questionable sometimes and something we want to keep track of. If the NFL starts saying, hey, we're making this tackle illegal because it's causing a lot of injuries, we have to take that into account. We have to adjust our simulations. We have to rerun our simulations because now players are not going to be tackling like that. Is that going to increase? Is that going to reduce the number of injuries? And then you have situations like, players resting more or teams, being more willing to pull their starters in games. Earlier this year, Celtics-Bucks were up 40 points at half and Celtics just pulled their entire starting 5. So that's a rebootable occurrence there because they played in the first half and not the second half. But that's not necessarily something we anticipate with our simulations. And then you've got got a picture of Embiid up there. He likes to rest. He likes to take his time off. Doesn't like to play against Jokic or anything like that. So things like that where players are just more load management becomes a thing. Players are more willing to rest. They might start the game, but they're questionable, so they only play the first quarter, and the teams know that ahead of time. That's something that is occurring more and more frequently, and something that we have to account for in our actual simulations. kind of leading up into that, or what kind of gets us there is, we've talked a lot about the predictive side of things with, forward-facing simulations and forward-facing staffing forecasts. Now let's think, there's a lot of descriptive analysis that has to be done. So our business intelligence team at PrizePicks is doing a lot of dashboarding and reboot analysis, looking at how do the numbers actually stack up. How many reboots are actually occurring, how many injuries are occurring, how many members are being impacted, and that's kind of what leads us into the previous slide of if we're not trending correctly, if there are more reboots or less reboots than we anticipate, what does that due to? Is that due to a rule change? Is that due to equipment changes? The equipment's more safe? What could it possibly be the cause of that? And then so we're basically just making sure that we're trending appropriately, making sure that we're tracking correctly, and re-simming if we need to. All right, so obviously, we implement this feature. Our members love it. It's a very cool way of protecting them from the unexpected when they're building these entries. Like I said, it doesn't stop right there, and this is not the only we don't only use this approach with reboots. Right now we're live with reboots in 5 markets, and we're always constantly looking at how can we iterate, how can we improve. It never stops. I have a picture of esports here. We love esports at PrizePicks. That's another kind of key function that we're working on. It would be cool to have reboots for esports. I mean, if a player sprains their thumb while clicking around, or you get a Charlie horse, who knows? Really, I mean, it could happen. Obviously, we don't necessarily have the data required for that at this point, but we want to make sure that we're protecting our members in all sorts of instances, whether it's our traditional sports, whether it's into pickleball or whatever it ends up being. Right now we're focused on the 5 main sports, but we're constantly iterating, constantly want to improve. And what it comes down to is it's not just about pricing that player projection. It's not just about knowing something about Mahomes or something about Kelsey. We want to make sure that every decision we make, the overarching goal is to protect our members from the unexpected, make sure that we are driving that engagement, driving that entertainment, and not just putting a projection up there. All right, so this is the cool stuff. Obviously we've talked about what we did and why we did it and kind of where that layers into. Now the impacts are what really, I think, kind of drive it home of who are we impacting, how are we, determining whether or not we're hitting our goals. So some cool stats here. We've impacted over 1 million unique members in the last year with reboots. So that means 1 million unique people who had an injury or had something in one of their entries that would have been a negative experience in the past, would have potentially driven them away from the platform, and now they're being protected by us. They're actively, we're saving that entry for them. And another really cool stat is 37% of total members who played rebootable markets had at least one entry with a reboot in it. So that means 37% of our members in those 5 markets in NFL, college football, MLB, NBA, and WNBA, any of those, 37% of those members had at least one reboot. So you think about whenever you implement a new feature or something like that, you're looking at lift, how many people are adopting this, how many people are being impacted. And normally 5% is an incredible number. You love it. You love to see anything, that's very significant. Being able to impact 37% of our total members who are playing these markets is absolutely massive. That means that we are, removing a negative experience for 37% of our members. And that's really what we're driving towards here. And then another cool call out is of our members that have a entry with a reboot in it, they now have a 67% chance to at least get a partial win on an entry that might have lost in the past, on something that they might have not necessarily been as engaged with in the past. All right, this is just some photos here of Twitter and kind of socials here. But us analytics people, obviously, we like to see the numbers. We're determining impact by looking at how many people were actually affected, and we're going to look at retention rates. We're going to see how it's actually driving top line KPIs. But I always think it's important to dive into other aspects. It's good to look on socials. It's good to really dive in and see unfiltered member feedback. What do people think? That's how we got here. That's how we determined that injuries and reboots and everything was something we wanted to solve. So I always think it's really cool to look at, go on Twitter after an injury, go on Twitter after a reboot, go through our Discord, see what it looks like. That's really getting close to the ground and seeing what actually our members are saying, if they're having problems, if they're happy with it, and then that leads us to be able to iterate further. If they didn't enjoy the reboot aspect of something, we can iterate further on it by keeping our head to the ground there. All right, So to recap here, talked about building a member-centric gaming platform, with data-driven initiatives. Like I said, there's a number of different ways you can do this. We spoke specifically about reboots today. I think it's a really cool feature that, encapsulates us being able to protect our members and us being able to use that data, to look forward-facing, on the both predictive and descriptive side. But in general, I think it's important to recap that, really the steps here are the same regardless of what kind of industry you're in, whether you're, looking at various different features or whatever it ends up being. What we need to do is key into those member pain points. So like I said, that's getting on the socials, that's doing member surveys, that's doing user research. All of that kind of stuff is super important to really figure out what do people like, what do they not like, and how can we improve that? And that leads us into the second step of get a business use case off of that. We found that injuries and players not necessarily playing the full game was creating a massive negative experience for a lot of our members. So then the question becomes, how do we develop a business use case of, let's solve that, let's figure out how to solve that. And then, for us data people, we want to make sure that we're utilizing data to, build out the predictive, the descriptive, all aspects that we can, make sure that we're, using those data insights correctly. We want to be data driven in every way. We don't ever want to necessarily just flip the switch because, hey, we can. Let's make sure that we use the data. Let's make sure that we feel confident about the underlying data. And then, like I said, we always want to iterate. It never stops. Continuous improvement is the name of the game, regardless of what you're working on. So we're always listening to feedback, making sure that the policy that we just rolled out is still solid. People are still enjoying it. If they're not, how can we improve? And is there an additional policy? Is there an addendum that we can add that really kind of takes it to the next level? We love rolling this stuff out. We love protecting our members. But it's not something that just stops, because we rolled one product out. It's always continuous. We're always looking to improve and iterate. Cool. Thank you. That's all I got. Now we got some questions. I think got people going around.
You mentioned how I suppose players can be questionable going into a game. How much do the model projections you have already account for the likelihood that a player will take the field, take the court? And as a result of this reboot feature, have you seen any gamification of of that feature? People playing, knowing that there's a good chance a player effectively gets voided and they get a guaranteed number of points.
Yep.
And how you account for that?
Definitely a really good question. So I don't think we've seen too much gamification. We feel very confident about the team's ability to ensure that we're not putting anything up on the board that can necessarily be taken advantage of in players being questionable. What I will say is it doesn't happen super often that a player comes in and it's known that they're not necessarily going to be. You had the Draymond issue. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with that, of him coming in for the tip. We rebooted that obviously because it falls in under our rules, but it's not a super frequent occurrence. And when it is known, we make sure to keep that player off the board in totality.
How do you think about sharper players that try to do the reboot stuff? Is that something that y'all worry about?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered that a little bit before. We're definitely not wanting to make this something where the 1% take advantage. When we design this feature, obviously we're looking at our 99%. We want to make sure that we're protecting our members across the board. What I will say is, even our sharper players can be negatively impacted by injuries and things like that. We specifically go out of our way to make sure that we're not necessarily leaving an edge up on the board, or that we're not necessarily creating a negative experience for some of our members and giving a positive for others. So, we want Reboot to be, in totality, a very good feature for all of our members. We're not necessarily super concerned about, one side or the other. Anyone want to tell a joke or something? Well, cool. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate the time.